cultural implications. So my talk starts actually with a little point of contrast. This is an older picture of a suburb in England, Wallsend, in the northeast of England. Actually, my brother just moved there. But this is back in the 1970s. It was a big shipbuilding industry area. So these are workers' cottages and a ship that's being built at the end of the street. But the name Wallsend comes not from the shipbuilding, but actually comes from Hadrian's Wall, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it was built by the Romans about 2,000 years ago. It's over 100 kilometers long, and it was part of the border of the Roman Empire in about 100 AD, both defensively and in terms of trade and power. And so this is very much part of not just the British landscape, but I guess the British cultural landscape. It's what I, as a British person, learned about at school. And not to oversimplify it, I learned to get very excited about 2,000-year-old Roman ruins. Here's another UNESCO World Heritage Site, actually only listed more recently in 2019. Hadrian's Wall, I think, was listed in the 1980s. This is the Butch cultural landscape, one of the world's most extensive and oldest aquaculture systems. It's in Victoria. It's not very far away from Melbourne. It's a complex of channels and weirs and dams developed by the Gunditjmara people to trap and store and harvest eel as the basis of their society. And it's not just 2,000 years old, it's at least 6,000 years old, with evidence of up to 8,000 years of human aquaculture activity here. And the Gunditjmara people have lived on this land for at least 32,000 years, with, of course, continuous indigenous cultures in Australia dating back at least 60,000 years. And that's taken as a pretty conservative estimate. And so, that's something that I really find amazing about living in Australia, that contrast between the cultural heritage I was aware of growing up and the cultural heritage that's here, Indigenous cultural heritage here in Australia, that I'm lucky enough to be very close to. And it's not just the difference in timescales, it's that until relatively recently, in fact, almost living memory, this place was still active use for aquaculture. So the Gunditjmara is a living culture. There are Gunditjmara people alive today whose grandparents could have actively used and maintained this site, and the way of life it supported until disrupted by colonization. So this, for me, is a pretty amazing thing. It's been a really amazing experience and discovery process journey for me, coming to live in Australia. And I'm sure other people who live in areas with Indigenous cultures may well feel the same. So in fact, normally in Australia, we begin any talk or meeting like this one with an acknowledgement of country, an acknowledgement of the place where we are. So I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin nations on whose unceded lands I'm talking to you from today. And I'd like to acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present, and the traditional custodians and ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, and in fact, wherever you're located around the world. And I'd also particularly like to extend my respect to any First people who may be present in the audience here today. So what's the connection here to location-based services? Well, first, indigeneity is all about location. Well, not all about location. It's an important part of being Indigenous, is a deep connection to place and location. And of course, alongside that comes an important understanding of the land, which may be, through ecology or climate or landscape, but also through the space itself, such as expressed through spatial abilities like navigation. So this is a contemporary piece of art by the Indigenous Torres Strait Islander artist, Alec Tepote, and it depicts Zugubel, spiritual human creatures in the Western Zanathkes, the Torres Strait cultures. They're navigating around the seas, in this case, partly using their superhuman abilities, but of course the navigation abilities of ordinary Australian and Torres Strait First Peoples are also pretty amazing. And there's clear evidence that Australians and Torres Strait Islanders were routinely navigating hundreds of kilometers across lands and seas for trade and social cultural exchange long before Europeans arrived. We've lost a lot of knowledge about exactly how that was achieved, but allowing for my imperfect understanding, as far as I do understand, the process is based on the rich oral history of astronomical knowledge, and that's maintained through star maps, cognitive maps of the stars, and then connected by song lines, so stories passed down generation to generation for thousands of years that connect particular patterns of stars to patterns of landmarks and routes and paths on the land. So song lines often follow on from one another, creating this kind of intricate map of place that's mirrored by the sky, by the night sky. When I first came across that idea, I actually, my first thought was that all sounds rather familiar. I think, in some ways, it's not a million miles from, let's say, the use of cognitive load theory in user interfaces. That's a common idea. And the idea there is that we manage the intrinsic complexity of tasks like navigation, like assisted navigation, by offloading extraneous complexity into the interface, into our user interface. And that allows us to concentrate limited cognitive resources on the intrinsic complexity of the task. And to me, song lines and star maps do something similar, not only storing data in the sky, but also helping with complex navigation tasks by providing a place to offload extraneous complexity in the night sky. Now, of course, an important caveat here, I'm not trying to draw any simplistic equivalences. I'm categorically not saying that Indigenous Australians discovered cognitive load theory, nor that CLT explains how Indigenous Australians navigated. What I am doing is just trying to illustrate that I think there are some really interesting ideas that we can learn from Indigenous science, as well as many kind of applications and problems that we in location-based services can tackle in connection with indigeneity. So what other connections can we find? Well, I thought I'd just mention some work that I was involved in when I started in the area of location-based services almost 20 years ago. And a particular interest then was in location privacy and algorithms for providing location-based services while still protecting individuals' location privacy. And this is a slide from one of the first papers I wrote in the area, given to the Pervasive conference in Germany in 2005. And here we coined the term obfuscation to describe the process of deliberately degrading the quality of location data in order to protect location privacy. And in this motivating example, if you're located in City Centre Park and your query is where's the nearest sushi restaurant, you actually just don't need very high quality information to provide a good answer to the question. So we explored a really simple algorithm for satisfying queries just like this. It's actually not hard to do. If we decompose that scenario on the previous slide into a graph, just as we normally do for routing. So we've got a collection of nodes and pairs of edges connecting edges connecting pairs of nodes. Then in the standard version of this problem, we have an origin and perhaps a number of destinations, nodes A, B, C, and D, and we run a single source shortest path algorithm, Dijkstra's algorithm, essentially, to compute in one pass the distance to all of the nodes in the graph. If instead we want to protect a navigator's location privacy, one way to do that is then just to decrease the precision of the location information that we release. So here, instead of specifying a single node as the starting locations, the origin, we instead specify a set of nodes. And we're just not being precise about which of those nodes is actually the starting location. And so then we can run a multi-source shortest path algorithm. And if you've not come across this, it's very straightforward. You effectively just add a dummy node and connect that dummy node with 0 weight edges to all of the source nodes or destination nodes, depending on which way around you run it, and then rerun Dijkstra shortest path from that dummy source node. And you can effectively get the information you need to answer those location, those obfuscated private queries. And so what's interesting, that was 2005, but of course you can do exactly the same thing, or pretty much the same thing, pretty much like that today with your phone. You'll, I think on iPhone since about iOS 14 and from Android for the past few releases, you've been able to specify whether you have access to precise location or not for particular services. So I find this area of the balance we're trying to strike here between acceptable quality and acceptable levels of privacy. It has always been a very interesting one. We know at one extreme, if you give up on privacy and you're happy to give away all of your information, well, then that's not hard to give people really high quality location-based services. And at the other extreme, if you're not prepared to give up any information, then it's going to be very difficult to provide location-based services. But that space in between where we can give up some of our privacy, but still hope to get some reasonably high quality location-based services. Now, if you'll permit me, I wanted to do another little digression, because when I was researching this talk, I was looking around at a number of things like, when iOS introduced the imprecise location. I was also looking at the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force GeoPriv standard, which was going up a few years back in an attempt to try and standardize how we exchange location information under privacy. And I was struck looking back that that initiative got into rocky waters, got into difficulty, talking about uncertainty. And I think often reading papers in our field, this happens to sometimes to us in research. Research can go off a little bit off the rails when there's a lack of clarity in really being, what we're talking about when we talk about uncertainty and these related concepts. So I wanted to again, give this formula that's from the literature, this Warboys and Clementini paper. There's always helped me. I've used this for at least 20 years and never yet gone wrong. So I think it's a very useful kind of clarification about what exactly we're talking about. So uncertainty under this description is really arises from imperfection in information. And most information deviates from perfection in some way, but actually geographic information always deviates from perfection. I've kind of was watching Mike Batty's talk yesterday, and there was in some ways a similar point there, that we can never have kind of total knowledge about the geographic world. It's just too complex. And then there are really only two major types of imperfection that we need to worry about. One is inaccuracy, a lack of correctness in information. So if I say I'm in Glasgow, well, that's just not correct. I'm not, I'm in Melbourne, so that's an inaccurate statement. Imprecision concerns a lack of detail. So if I say, well, I'm in Australia, that's entirely accurate, but just doesn't give you very much detail about where I am. And other types of imperfection really just hang off these two key orthogonal types of imperfection. So vagueness, for example, another very important type of imperfection, but it's really a special case of imprecision. Vagueness is the existence of borderline cases. So it's basically borderline boundary imprecision. So anyway, that I think is still very useful. It's there in our literature, it's there in our field, and I think it's really useful just to remind ourselves of this what exactly it is we're talking about. And certainly I found this model has steered me very well for many years and never seen me wrong. Coming back to location privacy, we can now say, well, actually, it's really imprecision that's going to be most useful for protecting privacy using obfuscation. Using inaccuracy or error is possible, and people have tried that, but effectively that means faking or lying about your location. And that's often much harder for a service provider to interpret and use. It probably requires additional information about how it is you're lying, some parameters for how you're lying, like a probability or a probability density function. And so that's kind of harder to do. But being imprecise, on the other hand, it's often possible to infer the level of precision from the information supplied. If I tell you I'm in the city centre park, well, you know from the boundary of the park how imprecise I'm being. And if I give you a set of nodes rather than a single node in the graph, again, you immediately know the level of imprecision from the context. So our approach, to doing this obfuscation work with imprecision does contrast a bit also with some of the other other approaches. For example, a trusted broker approach, where you give all of your information to a third party, but trust them not to reveal it further. And there's also a lot of kind of interesting work in location privacy that follows that line. But regardless, ultimately, this all comes back to control of information. That's really what location privacy is all about. It's about controlling sensitive information about your location. And that's why it's a special type. It's a special case of information privacy, defined here in standard way by Weston. And that control is also at the core of data sovereignty. Control of the information. Data sovereignty is all about the management and control of data, consistent with nation states, laws, practices, and customs. And the key point here about data sovereignty is whether you already know about it or not. It is a topic with which I think we're all familiar, either implicitly, even if not explicitly, because of course we all deal with data, research data, and it matters where we store that data from the perspective of data sovereignty. For example, in Australia, I can't store data I'm not allowed to store data on standard research data, that is, on standard Dropbox or Google Drive, because I can't be certain where that data will be located. If it's potentially subject to Australian laws, privacy laws, for example, or responsible data management laws. So if I move it out of the country, even inadvertently, it may subsequently become subject to another country's laws, and they may be in conflict. So it's quite likely this may be the case in your country too, and in your institution, and it's certainly part of kind of responsible data management in Australia. Now, if this is a headache for nation states, and it is, I think, an increasing headache, it's no surprise that it is a major headache for often marginalized Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples. So that's where Indigenous data sovereignty comes in. Indigenous data sovereignty is the right of Indigenous peoples to control data about them, by them, or about Indigenous peoples' territories. So protecting and maintaining and supporting Indigenous data sovereignty is, I think, a really fascinating research topic, certainly for me. And again, with these important cultural and social implications, and something that I think, as location-based service researchers, we've got some nice contributions we could potentially make. Just a concrete example connected with this Indigenous data sovereignty, going back to the Butch Cultural Heritage Site, as part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site application, it was important to collect data, a lot of data about the site, and in particular spatial data. And part of that was to capture a large amount of LiDAR data about the location. This was really valuable. It revealed an awful lot, not just about the current land, but also historically the ways that the land had been used. Importantly, it was captured by a Victorian government department, so a state government department of environment, land, water and planning. And they obviously did this work in collaboration with the traditional owners. And effectively, that collaboration means that the LiDAR data, when collected, becomes the property of the traditional owners of the land, the Gunditj Mara people. In practice, that means it's the Gunditj Mirring Traditional Owners Aboriginal Corporation who are the representatives of the traditional owners, and it becomes those traditional owners' data to control once it's captured, even though it wasn't specifically collected by those traditional owners. It's regarded as about Indigenous people's territory, so that Indigenous nation has sovereignty over that data. That's quite a subtle but really important shift, I think, in how we work with data. Maybe even, I think, 5 years ago, but definitely 10 years ago, this is definitely not how it would have been organized in Australia. And it probably isn't how it's organized today in many countries, perhaps even most countries. The data probably would be owned by the company, perhaps, that performed the capture, or maybe the government department that paid for it. And maybe it would have been made public open access, but the point is the decision about exactly what happened to the data wouldn't have been made by the traditional owners of the land. That's the sovereign nation that's connected to the land for thousands of years. And today it is, which is really a major step forward. And I think there are other places in the world where these important initiatives are going on. And I think even in Canada, I noticed there's increasing work around data repatriation, giving data back to Indigenous peoples and to the traditional owners. Yeah. So another area where these sorts of issues arise frequently is in connection with place names, and that's something that as LBS researchers, or spatial information scientists, we know how important place names are. Across Australia and many other countries, place names today often reflect the recent colonization rather than the thousands of years of Indigenous heritage. And in Australia, for example, we've a documented history of some awful names, not simply racist and offensive and culturally insensitive, but often frankly harrowing. This is just one example from amongst many. The Leap in Queensland was named for an incident where in the years shortly after European invasion, an Aboriginal woman was driven off a cliff by her pursuers with a child in her arms. The woman died, but the child miraculously survived. And I think I find it hard to know what's more disturbing, the story, the fact of the story itself, or the fact that probably the name became known, the name stuck because of the child miraculously survived, whereas in so many other atrocities and massacres, Indigenous Australians did not. There are a number of initiatives, to establish dual names, or better still, renaming places. Here's one. Australia Post have recently changed their policy to encourage people to use Indigenous place names on letters. And around Australia, there are many other initiatives going on right now to further this at the very least, dual names. And here again, I think, well, there's important work that potentially could use location-based services to help, enable the capture and use of Indigenous place names more easily. But again, when we go down that route, we also have to be really quite aware of the status of this data. Where's the data going to come from, and how's it going to work? Just as a few of the kind of key issues, well, recognizing Indigenous place names, at least in Australia, obviously that requires consultation with Indigenous groups, with the traditional owners. But then what happens to the data unless there is some rights of ownership, some data sovereignty for the traditional owners? Then it really just becomes another form of digital colonialization. We're just taking information without any responsibilities for that information. There are a whole range of other challenges as well. Sometimes simply knowing the place names, they may be contested. In Australia, there's over 40 different languages in Victoria alone, Indigenous languages in Victoria alone. And I think over 300 in Australia. So actually knowing what the place name is not a straightforward matter. Spelling place names is a particularly tricky one in Australia, because Indigenous the language is a spoken language and not a written language. So frequently our databases store the it's easy to store the written names, but typically Indigenous people don't particularly mind how it's spelled. It's much more important how it's said, how it sounds. And then we have the usual or perhaps more familiar issues with crisp boundaries and geometries for locations that are not at all crisp and not clearly bounded. So they're just some of the issues that I think come up when thinking about Indigenous place names and integrating them into location-based services. But I do think there's all sorts of applications for what you might call an Indigenous applications of LBS, of location-based services, not just cultural heritage, but health and education and community resilience. I think my experiences is that there's a lot of potential for both for broader community resilience, but also Indigenous community resilience, and a lot of appetite for being able to have new ways of sharing traditional knowledge, sharing cultural knowledge. And of course, all sorts of other applications like tourism and emergency response, environmental protection. I think in Australia, again, we're just beginning to wake up to a lot of the traditional knowledge around fire management, something that we haven't always done very well here. And so I think underpinning all of this is the need to get data sovereignty right. If we don't have good mechanisms for ensuring data sovereignty, then none of the rest of these applications or challenges we can really start to address. But with a mechanism, or with better understanding of how to manage Indigenous data sovereignty, I think there are all sorts of other interesting areas. I've mentioned some about place and space, and uncertainty and privacy, also just as important for Indigenous location data as for individual, for non-Indigenous location-based service consumers. A language, it was 4 a.m. for me, so unfortunately I didn't get to see Ross's keynote, but I'm hoping that there are some touch points here with what I've been talking about, and perhaps what Ross has been saying about place and space and language. And ontologies, I think it's been very interesting. I've read a number of the work by Renée Sieber and some of her co-authors on the differences and some of the implicit structures, ontological structures, that as a non-Indigenous scientist I bring to my view of the world that don't always accord with Indigenous ontologies. I'm just going to mention one more area where, or one idea. This is actually a kind of research idea that I've long been keen to do, but I've never actually got the chance to do it. So I thought I'd tell this community about it, and then if anybody wants to go and do it, or even come and ask me and work with me on it, I'd be very interested to sort of explore it more. The idea is connected with decentralization in location-based services. And again, it has its roots in this community. Mark Langenrich, many of you may know, had a very interesting paper a few years back on the idea of virtual location-based data that is located, that's only visible in a particular location. And his motivating example was, if I'm in my office and I go to a cafe, well, I might leave a post-it note on the door, and that sort of tells people who are physically at my door, oh, I better go and get Mark, in this case at the at the cafeteria. This work was designed actually mainly more for privacy protection, for location-based privacy protection. But I think there's all sorts of possibilities for Indigenous data and Indigenous data sovereignty of this sort of approach. One of the issues that comes up a lot, I think, in my experience of interacting with Australian Indigenous researchers, is the importance of being in relation to place. And let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by that. Often the need and indeed the passion for Indigenous data sovereignty is not about restricting the flow of information. Sometimes it is, and there are many instances where data taken about the land is used to further disadvantage the traditional owners of that land. But it's often not, because traditional owners want to restrict access to information. In fact, quite the opposite. Traditional owners often love to talk about the land and being on country, and want to share their passion for the land, for being on country, with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. But to do that means entering into a relationship with the land and with the traditional owners, being in relation to place. I think an example that's really stuck with me in the local language here of the Wurundjeri people, Woiwurrung, the word for welcome is Wominjeka. But Wominjeka doesn't just mean welcome, it also means state your purpose. So it's really about starting a dialogue, not just, it's not as simple as welcome. So, I kind of often wondered if we as a community should be thinking about developing location-based services that support this sort of model, where, say, data is physically in a location on country. That would help with data sovereignty, and you'd need to be physically there or near that location to access that information. You have to travel there to access it. But in doing that, you put yourself in relation to country and also open yourself up to the opportunities for deeper engagement with the traditional owners. I did work a few years ago on decentralization, which again, I think offers a mechanism to achieve, some of these sorts of ideas. But there we go. Who knows? Maybe someone will pick up that idea. So just to end, I'd like to just maybe reflect briefly on some of the things that I've learned working with Indigenous researchers. I don't know if anybody here was at GI Science in Melbourne in 2018, but we opened it actually with a panel session on Indigenous knowledge and geographic information science. And the panelists there include Mark McMillan, who was Professor of Indigenous Engagement at RMIT and a Wiradjuri man, and also Auntie Di and Nawit Carolyn, who talked a lot about their understanding of place. And actually, again, I don't know if anybody remembers who was there, but Auntie Di showed us and talked through her possum skin cloak, which is actually really a reflection of her life story. And it was really quite moving to be there. She was very nervous initially because she was being at this conference with potentially a whole bunch of technical GIS people, and that wasn't kind of her expertise. But it was really lovely to be there for that, and certainly very moving for me. And so, well, I learned a few things from these collaborators. I think from Mark, one of the things I learned was the importance as a non-Indigenous person of actually having a go, not always waiting for permission for everything from my Indigenous collaborators. It was, certainly when I started working with Indigenous researchers, I was always a little bit hesitant, often asking, is it okay to do this? Is it okay to do that? And certainly Indigenous people absolutely need to be in control of decisions that affect them and their lives. And that sort of idea is at the core of Indigenous data sovereignty. But also Indigenous people don't need the burden of holding my non-Indigenous hand every step of the way through my journey. And if I get things wrong, I hope I haven't here. I didn't, obviously I had permission for the images I'm using, but I hadn't cleared this talk with an Indigenous person. I may have made mistakes. I do make blunders. And then my Indigenous colleagues usually tell me, and often very directly. And I had to learn quickly that it's also not their job to manage my feelings about being rebuked. It's my job to listen, to learn and try and get things right next time. But actually that idea, I think I found very empowering, that it's up to me to have a go and to get involved. And then the other thing I learned from Auntie Di and Nawit Carolyn here is also not always to jump to solution mode. I think as a technologist, I do have a default sort of tendency to jump to solutions. And, so for example, when we started talking, I started to think, oh, right, we could, embed some sensors in the environment. We could, upload a whole bunch of Indigenous data into those sort of nodes and then set up a decentralized network. And, I think Auntie Di and Nawit Carolyn were often, let's just take it one step at a time and not just jump to solutions, and actually take some time to listen and to really understand and engage, to learn really from people who have an enormous amount of knowledge and experience to share. So it's been an extraordinary privilege to me to have this opportunity to work with such people, and something I will really always treasure. So I suppose that's the note to end on, is if you do get the opportunity also to work in this area, I most highly recommend it. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, Matt. We already got quite a lot of questions. I'm not sure if we can cover all of them, so I'm just going to ask some of them that are related. One group of questions are about how technology affected Indigenous people. And for example, there are apparently some studies showing that because people, Inuit people using GPS now, they're not that capable to recognize landmark in, I don't know, in the area. There aren't that many. And so the way that they perceive environment is very different. Have you looked at the other way, the transition of technology on that, or data sovereignty aspect that has changed over the years or so?
Yeah, it's a good question. And yes, I think I'm also aware of that work that shows, I wasn't aware of it for Indigenous communities, but, I think there is pretty solid evidence that people in general do lose certain spatial abilities if we don't use them, and technology can, can essentially mean that we don't use them as much. But I do think that technology also brings many opportunities, and my experience of working with Indigenous researchers is they're every bit as alive to those opportunities as non-Indigenous researchers. And there are potentially some really interesting opportunities to to respond with new ways to for example, share cultural knowledge, and to particularly intergenerational cultural knowledge. I think that's something where elders speaking to younger members of the community, and sometimes technology is a real bonus there. It really helps foster that exchange.
Yeah, okay. The other type of questions, well, two actually, very related, but it's about how you engage with these people, because they are minorities and usually not inaccessible, perhaps ways that we talk to them, and how you incentivize getting some information to talk to them, get connected. What's your approach to talk to these people?
Well, I'm very lucky working at RMIT, because we have history of a number of Indigenous academics, and we still prioritize trying to make sure that we do have good representation, not good representation, but at least some representation from Indigenous Australians on the academic staff. So that's really easy. In some ways it's just like any other academic. You go and find an excuse to go and chat and find common shared interests. I do think, I know that, for example, when I was talking a little bit about the capturing place names, I know that the Victorian government do run a number of sort of workshops for that, and not unreasonably, often Indigenous people, traditional owners, are paid for their time and for their knowledge, because it is time, and in the past that was somehow sometimes almost approached as a favor to the Indigenous people, whereas it's quite the opposite. It's so sometimes if it's workshops and if there's data, that's appropriate, but also it's mainly just through that dialogue and understanding what's in it for everybody, what's in it for the researchers, whether or not they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, and what's the benefit to the community. And I think if you understand that, and if everybody understands, yes, there really is benefit, it's worth everybody's time, then that's when things really start to move.
Yeah, we've got like 3 or 4 questions related to the conflict and somehow universality of privacy and sovereignty, that I'm going to summarize them into one. You mentioned yourself that in one country, maybe the rules and regulation are different from another country. And presumably that can be the case for different group of people, something that is very valuable and very prestigious sorts of element or data that is not going to be shared because it is very private, needs to be shared because government requires them, and how you manage that conflict. There are more questions about the trust. Are you breaking the trust if you ask some data that they don't want to share, but they have to because of the government? So if you could just comment on different aspects of that, that would be great.
Yeah, that's a very good question and a very tricky one as well. I don't have any cut and dried answers here, but yes, you're absolutely right that there are often quite different approaches to information, which may vary culturally. Certainly in Australian Indigenous cultures, there is some information that is for men and some information that is for women, and that's respecting that is really important. Even though that isn't necessarily something that in my culture I would consider as a kind of boundary. But yeah, I think negotiating everything with a desire to learn, and I guess being clear about your motivations as a researcher, I think certainly in my limited experience has always led to the right outcomes, because then kind of everybody understands what they're aiming for, and then it's possible to learn from each other. And when there is something like that, where there's actually a cultural sensitivity that I'm not aware of, then as long as it's clear that I'm doing this with my best, with the best of intentions, then people respond to that very well and will say, well, that's just wrong, you can't do it that way. And then I have to go, all right, sorry, yeah, I didn't realize that. And learn quickly, I think, is something I've tried to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't think we've got time for the rest of the questions, but I can email them to you later on, or if anyone wants to continue the conversation, because I see there are a lot coming still. You can email Matt. He's also very good with email, I think. He is good at quite a few things that I know. One is that diversity element that he mentioned, the inclusion. I must say that I felt like Margaret Thatcher when I organized this event, because, as you know, Margaret Thatcher was the first female Prime Minister of the UK. She was a daughter of a working class family, but she was not the best person to working class people or women. Just having certain characteristics does not make you the best person to act in their interest. And I realized that very painfully when I try to talk to Matt, because he recognizes that very well, and he reminds me, okay, you need to add this. This is not accessible to these people. You need to have some representation on this panel. And that's amazing. I would like to say that I'm really happy that we have Matt, and I would encourage every other person in this room to be like him, to remind other people to be as inclusive as possible, to promote diversity. And he's amazing with that too. But he's good at email, so please feel free to email him if you have any other question. But I try to send all the questions to him in case you want to get the answer. Thank you very much, Matt. We really enjoyed your talk. Now we have a break until 10, sharp 10. We will be back for the first paper session. So I'll see you all at 10. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah.